and welcome to Reiki Women Podcasts. It's Bronwen Logan here from Reiki with Bronwen. Next to me is Micahela Daystar from Heartscapes Reiki, and there we have Carrie Varela. Hey, Carrie. And Carrie is from the Reiki Healing Society. Oh, we've just been having this discussion and we're going to continue it now with you. And it's all about what is traditional. So are you doing a traditional practice? Are you practicing a traditional practice? It might be the system of Reiki. It might be another modality. But how do you know it's traditional? And I'm using little air quotes here because we don't know, or do we? And how do we find out? How do we know what's real, what isn't real? How do I know what someone told me? Oh my goodness, it gets so confusing. And I was just saying, after practicing for 25 years, I find that within the system of Reiki, the mainstream aspect of the system of Reiki may not be that interested in what that might mean, that word traditional. I'm not sure. So, I would love to find out what Micahela and Carrie have to say on the subject, and also what you think and what you practice and how do you feel about it? And does it make any difference to you as to what you practice and knowing about that practice? And do you need to feel a truth with that, or can you just leave that behind? I don't know. Who'd like to go first here? Carrie, you're up.
Yeah, I'll speak to this. Yeah, so I mean, for me, for many years, I practiced the Reiki that came to me through my lineage and through my teachers. And I did seek out other teachers, and, didn't always get what I was expecting to get from those teachers. But, it took me a little bit of time to get the lay of the land of different aspects of Reiki, different lineages of the system of Reiki, and really find my own home within Reiki. And I feel very fortunate that I have found that home, through Michaela kind of connected me to the Usui Reiki Ryoho, and Bronwen. I took trainings with you and really felt like, oh, this feels like home. Like this feels very aligned for me. And this lineage of Reiki, Usui Reiki Ryoho, we call it a traditional lineage of Reiki. And maybe we could put some other air quotes around that, which are, you know, unauthentic, which is kind of a weird thing because I don't know. I feel like there's an ego bias there. Like authentic seems like there's kind of like, oh, this is better or whatever. Maybe we call it, Reiki more, that brings forward some of the spiritual and cultural connections of Japan, and really connects Reiki back to some of those spiritual and cultural traditions from Japan in a more intentional way. You all might have other ways of describing it, but I've definitely struggled like kind of describing it, because I think sometimes when people say I practice a traditional form of Reiki, there's this like, I don't know, inherent bias that people think of it as rigid, rule based, not as powerful, um, uh, a bunch of different things,
Yeah.
right? And that's not my practice of that. My practice is I've actually always sought to get as close as I can to understanding the history and the source of this knowledge that the system of Reiki and the founder of Reiki really woven together in order to create a whole system of healing, a whole different modality of energy healing. And so that kind of naturally led me on the path of traditional Reiki. And also because I have this background in anthropology, and I just feel like there is this aspect of my own spiritual journey has been more about really trying to understand um, different world religions and spiritual traditions, and really try to um, not whitewash them and not think about it through a very Western white focused lens, which tends to come with some baggage around superiority, and that there's been generations and generations of people who've gone to wars over whose religion is better. And that, that is an unfortunate aspect, I think, of our history as humans. And I've always thought, like, we need to stop fighting about whose religion is better. Let's start to understand each other's religion and see, maybe that true spirit of spirituality, of spirit that shines through the different forms of religious traditions out there. And then, of course, for me, it's like, where do I find a place where I really feel at home, like where I feel like I can um, feel connected to my own spirituality and nourish my own spirituality, um, and support other people in that capacity too. So, um, yeah, I think it's unfortunate that sometimes there's tends to be this stigma around traditional forms of Reiki, and that's not really um, my my practice of it. I feel like, traditional forms of Reiki are incredibly powerful. It's incredibly meaningful to connect more to the spiritual source of these traditions. And, specifically within Reiki, I think it's given me a larger cultural context with which to understand Reiki. And that when now that I understand, some of the deity aspects of Mount Karama, for example, like there's this greater depth of awareness that I can feel into, whether and it deepens my practice.
Indeed. Yeah, I mean, this is a topic that we all talk about a lot. This is something that's important to the three of us, certainly, and something that I hope and believe that this podcast has been, a platform to have this conversation and to open that up to anybody who wants to be in dialogue about it. And a couple of important things I think that that you said, Carrie, that I wanted to kind of pull a thread from. First is this idea of like, what even is traditional? Like, what does that mean exactly? How can we understand that? And how can we be clear about what we mean by it so that it doesn't become a word that is so malleable and, unstructured that it gets used in ways that don't actually mean a whole lot. And then this piece around how to, be in authenticity with a practice in light of what we mean by traditional, and at the same time be true to ourselves and to find a home. I love how you said that, to find our home inside of our practice. There's an interesting place that the three of us fall into, and that many of our listeners do, in that our practice is both very, very personal, right? We have our own relationship with the system of Reiki that is deeply personal and is deeply entwined with who each of us is and what our personal histories are and our personal lineages and what we know outside of the context of Reiki. And then we're also teachers. And so our practice is also public facing, right? It has a dynamic quality to it that is different than if it was a personal practice. And so, a lot of the way that I'm, talking about this in this conversation is, I would say, maybe more leaning on the side of people who have some sort of public facing aspect, right? How are we talking about Reiki publicly? How are we teaching it? How are we communicating it to people? But I would say that all of these things also matter just as much in terms of our personal relationship with it. But beginning with that question of what even do we mean by traditional? Carrie, you and I have a similar, background in our training, in that we both were first trained, well, at least I'll speak for myself. I think this maybe resonates with you. Trained in a form of Reiki that was called traditional Usui Reiki, and that I now would identify as traditional Western American Reiki. And, some of the characteristics of that being a strong emphasis on the chakra system as the energy system, which is where our conversation actually began, was kind of looking at that fact, the pervasiveness of including the chakra system as the primary way of understanding the energy body within the system of Reiki, when that system is not a Japanese system. And, other things like finding spirit guides and, just kind of elements of other traditions that have been kind of melting potted together to create Western Reiki. And then that gets called traditional because it's kind of more the first form that became widely acknowledged in the West. It's not the form that Takata taught, not specifically, but it's the form that became most widely known. And then that's contrasted to, further out branches of Reiki that get mixed up with different traditions. So the word traditional oftentimes means something that I don't actually mean by it. And I tend to not even use the word traditional because it so often points to that kind of early Western form of Reiki. So I think what we're kind of working with here is, what does it mean to practice a thing, Reiki in this case, from the perspectives of as much as we can of what it originally was. What was the historical, cultural, spiritual context in which it was developed? What did it mean? What did the elements mean in their context, as well as we can know? What relationship did it have to other forms of practice in that society? And then how can we then make meaning of that and relevance of all of those things in our day and time? Now, I want to preface that by saying, big asterisk, all of this is kind of within the capacity that we have, right? I am a white American Californian woman. I was raised in the latter half of the 20th century, early, 21st century. I have never been to Japan. There's no way I could ever, without significant lifestyle changes, I could ever truly practice Reiki from its origins. It's just, I don't have the world view, like the immersed mindset of growing up inside of that culture with all of that context and that history in me to truly practice it in its pure and original form. And that's okay, right? Like traditions move around, right? Humans take traditions all around the world, and it does change. And so we can acknowledge both of those things as true at the same time. We can acknowledge the value in understanding what a thing is as well as we can from its original context. And then when we take it on in our practice, we're going to influence it because it's inside of us and it's inside of our life and it's inside of our traditions and our lineages. And so the question is, how do you bring integrity to that? And there's a lot of different ways to, that's a dynamic question, right? There's no one answer to that. It's really kind of how we each approach it. But that really kind of touches on that second piece that you had mentioned that I wanted to thread against, which is how do we hold those two things together? Being as in integrity as we can with the origins of the practice, recognizing the benefit of doing that and the limitations of that, and then also make it our own. Alive in our life in a way that works for the context of our life. And, really a lot of it begins with that knowing it as well as we can piece, right? Because if we bypass that, right, we bypass research and, studying history and, to the degree that we can, there's ways to kind of digest information about historical, cultural, societal context that doesn't have to feel like you're in grad school or like you have to, read 1,000 books, right? There's ways to digest that information. There's ways that it's been distilled. I mean, Bronwen, your books have distilled this information in a very accessible form. So you can take that research, as deep as you want. I personally am a historian by training, so I love that stuff, right? But, I don't want to make it sound like you now have to enter graduate studies of Japanese history in order to practice the system of Reiki. But as well as we can, and acknowledging that and acknowledging where our blind spots are, the places that we're not strong, the things we don't still know as well. And then acknowledging if we're bringing something else alongside of that practice, that is its own thing as well. There's a musician and a musical anthropologist who I just adore named Leah Song, and she and her sister are the group Rising Appalachia. They're a Appalachian folk band, and they study music from all over the world and go live in different places and study the folk music of many different places. They understand folk music traditions from their own lineages, their Celtic lineages, their lineages inside of Appalachia in the United States, very, very, very deeply. And I was in a class with Leah not too long ago that was about kind of learning and researching our own cultural roots through the lens of story and of song. And she said something that was so, I mean, it was beautiful, and it was so relevant to my practice of Reiki and to our conversation here. She talked about in her studies, she constantly is working with people who are dedicating their lives to preserving musical traditions as pristinely as possible, you know, making and utilizing instruments in the original form, using, the specific types of melodies and the ways that songs are put together. I don't know music well enough to talk about that in an intelligent way, but just all of the structure and nuance that goes into making music and making musical traditions and letting those songs, like using the original songs from 100 years ago, or, however long they're focusing their studies on, and preserving them in an exact form, right? And that's so important, because otherwise we lose things. At the same time, she says, I'm not that kind of musician. I want to know all of that. I need those people to retain that clarity of tradition so that I can learn it in as clear as possible what it is. But my music is going to be infused with a lot of me and a lot of my, other things that I love and other traditions that I've studied, right? And so my music is not going to sound exactly the same, but I can tell you exactly where those melodies came from. I can tell you where the traditional instruments that we use are, right? I can tell you about the different elements that make my music, but my music is not traditional in the same sense that some of my teachers' music is. And she talked about feeling conflicted about that and having people challenge her about that. No, you should be using your platform to preserve these traditions in their perfect form. And, she's just at peace with the place where she is, that the music that's in her soul is bringing together a lot of different experiences. And I feel very similarly to my Reiki practice, that I feel like it is my duty to understand those origins as well as I can. And my Reiki practice is different than those traditions in a lot of ways, but in a lot of ways it's very similar. And I can tell you the places where my practice and my teaching comes directly from that history, and the places where it comes from some other piece of me. And I can, articulate that and talk about why those things come together in my practice. And for me, that's how I've answered that question. That's not how anybody else needs to answer it, but that's how I have held a traditional practice of Reiki and still allowed it to be my own. What about for you, Miss Bronwen?
Well, when I started realizing, when I first studied the system of Reiki, or first learned the system of Reiki, that it was sort of what I had in front of me was a mishmash of things, and I didn't quite know what it was. I did what you guys have done. I went and started looking around, talking to different people. And there was this couple who lived in America called Light and Adonai. I don't know. Have you ever heard of them? Yeah. Now I think they lived in Arizona. I don't think either of them are still on our planet anymore, but it's been a while. But they, for all the fact that their names sounded sort of new agey, they actually were very into researching the system of Reiki. And they were the ones that really sort of turned my head, and they were like, well, look, there's all these practices, and we're looking at where all these practices came from, and what we can see is this. And it was like, wow, that's amazing. They can actually find out where things came from. And that, I really am very grateful to them for pointing, my head in that direction, so I could sort of see things and start to put things together for myself. And they actually, I think, called their practice Usui Reiki Ryoho. At that point, there weren't a lot of people using that. I mean, it had been used here and there, but really what it means is Usui Reiki, Usui, the founder, Reiki, the practice, Ryoho, healing method. That's all that it says. It doesn't say anything more. And it it really is for people who practice it. And I don't know if they're totally aware of that, but it is like an umbrella. Yeah. So it doesn't have anything specific. And it's saying we're practicing Usui's healing method. That's all it's saying. And so the people who practice Usui Reiki Ryoho, attempt to do that. Now, what I can say is that I have no idea what people actually teach under that umbrella generally. I mean, because for what you were saying, Micahela, how do we know? Someone will learn something and they'll take it away and then they'll do this, that, and the other with it. I don't know. And it's not something that is regulated or policed. So for every person who comes to the system of Reiki, there is this sort of openness, I think, and this space that they step into, and to try to find your way through that can be difficult. And I think people are still doing what the three of us have done, which is go to numerous places, talk to different people, and try to find your way through in that way. Which is fine, I guess, and possibly similar with other practices, but I do think it is within the system of Reiki, it's incredibly diverse, and you really are going to come across a whole bunch of ideas that may not correlate with one another, which is in itself just confusing. So yeah, for me, it is important to know what I do. I know that, look, ultimately it's the practice and what I'm finding in that practice. But you know what? There are different ways to practice. And is it I could do a practice that could take me off in a direction. I'll tell you a little story. So once when this is before I studied the system of Reiki, and I was in India and I was in some place somewhere. Anyway, I bought a secondhand book and I went to bed, and it was all about opening your third eye. Right. So, I was sort of trying to find things. I was interested. I was searching. So I read this book, and then I went to sleep, and I was doing the practices before I went to sleep of, how to open my third eye. Went to sleep, woke up, and there was this man standing in front of the door, and it was really scary. It was sort of like I felt like it was almost demonic, and I totally freaked myself out, right? And it's because I had no idea what I was doing. I don't know what or who, whether it was my imagination or whether there was, I just don't know. And all I can say is that it wasn't the correct path. It wasn't a correct practice. It was just doing something, and doing something doesn't necessarily take us anywhere. Yeah, and yeah, that was pretty scary. And I left that place. I couldn't even stay in that room another night. It was too frightening. So, we need to find ways that we can have a path to travel along, to learn along, and to do that, and to do it with integrity, which is so important, because that integrity is going to be a foundation for us, and part of that path, part of the strength. It's like the handrails to hold on to on our path. And I think that we do need to understand what it is that we're doing. That's part of our foundation and grounding in our practice. Otherwise, we can just go off into la la land, and who knows where we end up going with that. So I think structure is incredibly important, and we can only find structure true structure we can only find through a historical perspective. I think it's the thing that's, you guys always use the word container. It's the container, it's the thing that holds us and keeps us within our practice. And once we have that structure, and we know that structure, and we embody that structure, then we can be free from that structure. but only then. We can't just be free and just do whatever, right? So there are certain ways of doing things. And I know, Carrie, that was such a good point at the beginning about people think it's going to be really difficult. Well, I mean, and we were laughing actually before this, that a lot of the more new age stuff can be incredibly difficult. You do have to. I remember when I first heard that other people were doing all these different sorts of attunements and started collecting all these attunements, and students would say things like, oh yeah, when I learnt an attunement, I had to actually do this particular process 10 times. Then I had to go round and round in a circle 5 times this way, then back that way. It was so long and I couldn't remember it. That is complicated. That is difficult. Try doing the Reiju. Simple, beautiful structure. Yeah. So we're all different and we're all going to need different amounts of structure, possibly as well. That's true. But we do need it. And it is something that it's going to guide us. And once we are firmly on that path and we can really feel it under our feet and we're grounded and moving through, then we can start to let go a little more and a little more and a little more to be totally embody. I mean, a practice like Reiki, it is about the energy of everything. It's not just this small thing. It is enormous. So I also liked what you were saying about it possibly not being as powerful. That's part of that sort of thing. Well, it's incredibly powerful if you can follow that path. But what I have noticed within the system of Reiki, there are a lot of new practices that come in and they say, oh, more powerful than 10 times more powerful than that, or, and really, I don't know what that means. I think, I think it's all in people's head to start with. We can, if I imagine that what I'm doing is more powerful, then I might feel good about myself and feel more feel better than someone else. Yeah, I think that's sort of where it comes down to. But if we think of this as a personal practice with integrity, then what's really going on is what we're doing inside, and really, that is the path that we're walking ourselves. What were some of the other things that I was thinking of? We talked previously about, well, it's come up at different times, so do I need to be Japanese? Do I need to be a Buddhist? Do I need to be a Shinto practitioner? Do I need to be these things to be able to practice a system of Reiki? As both of you have said, no, we don't. But we do need to have our best understanding of that practice. And for me, I find it fascinating, and I love the fact that I can actually delve deeper into my practice because it actually is from a different culture. And that's just really, really interesting. And we can really, that can be a whole journey in itself. It doesn't have to be. That's the thing, right? It can be that you can take what you're taught and sit with that and work with that. I personally love the fact that there's a lot, the Japanese culture is so fascinating, and we can, draw a lot of, we can see from the culture how it has influenced the system of Reiki so deeply, and that's truly beautiful. So our paths are all different. No one's path is the same. So it doesn't mean we all have to be researchers, or, like someone might want to become a Buddhist, someone else might want to learn the Japanese language. There's all different things that people might want to do or not. But it is about recognition and understanding and really having that grounding underneath your feet as you practice.
I love all of this, and I think I've really struggled with this in my life, in my practice of Reiki, my career path, and really trying to figure out how I can authentically weave in, the different influences in my life. And for me, primarily Reiki and yoga, and they've always just been there together. So, in my understanding of, well, actually, when I, found Reiki and then it started talking about chakras, I was like, oh, this is so awesome, because yoga and yoga talks about chakras too. And I thought it was natural, that they combined them together, or just kind of had this maybe more culturally homogenous idea, like, oh, this is Eastern world, and that's why they're together, or been brought together. And then really studying cultural and spiritual appropriation, I began to realize and unpack that, yeah, these the chakras and Reiki are very different. They come from totally different cultures and worldviews, and different timelines in the history of different modalities. And yeah, it got me inspired to understand more. And so I done what I did in Reiki within yoga, as I've gone back to teachers who've studied and understand primary sources within yoga about the chakras. I invested in a lot of courses and trainings to understand the chakras from prior to Western influence, and understand the evolution of the chakras as they came to be. And in my studies, it's just there's this blending that Micahela was talking about. We bring these things to the United States, and we just feel this license, or to the Western world, we feel this license to modify, to shift, to change, to make them be bigger, better, bolder, more aligned with our worldview. And it's problematic. It's really sad. And like within yoga, yoga in India, prior to Western influence, like, yoga is not called yoga. Yoga is pronounced yog. Yog, that's the correct pronunciation of it. And in fact, the Western world couldn't pronounce that. So they started calling it yoga, which is more like phonetic based on how it's written, right? And now it's that word yoga has overtaken, and now in India they don't call it yog, they call it yoga. So it's just this form of blending and modifying and changing. It really does have some roots in racism and this kind of cultural extrapolation. And what I've discovered about the chakras is that you really can't take, as much as we want to do this in the Western world, we can't take the chakras out of yoga and out of this whole worldview that is interwoven into it, and understand it purely as it is. Because yoga, or the chakras, are really related to the different limbs of yoga, the different states of mind, the different states of meditation that you can find in yoga. It's related to the movement of energy through the subtle body, which is very deep and complex. And it's and the whole Western chakra system literally, like, it came from yoga, and these, like, one or two primary sources came over to the West, and we made it into something totally different. And now that chakra understanding has really come back to India, and then that's the story on the chakras, like our Western worldview. And so this whole context and depth is being lost, not only to the Western mind, but also to new generations in India. And certainly for those of us in the world of energy healing, right? So, like, Reiki is a subset within energy healing. There's a larger umbrella of different forms and modalities of energy healing, and certainly the chakras could fit into and underneath that umbrella. And it's challenging, when I practice both, to want to bring them together, but also to recognize that you can't. And even if you considered yourself like a Reiki practitioner, well, actually, I shouldn't say you can't. People are obviously bringing the chakras and Reiki together in many different aspects and ways. And so it's really not for me to say that they can't do that. But culturally, they are totally different different systems, and it kind of shades over this Japanese worldview on the subtle body, which is different. It's different than the chakras. And many of us in the Western world, we've lost that too. So I think of like, those of us on the path of feeling connected to energetic forms of healing, want to provide this kind of service to others, or feel like we are, a practitioner of that for ourselves. It doesn't negate that bypass that's happening, where we have to understand the tools we're using for healing, and we really have to understand them deeply. Like, so whether you call yourself a Reiki practitioner or an energetic practitioner, which as an energetic practitioner, perhaps, or energy healer, or however you'd name that, you might feel more licensed, right, to bring in elements from different cultures, to work more fluidly with the chakra system, for example. But that doesn't negate like the need to understand what chakras really are. And if we don't understand that we're just a leaf that doesn't understand the whole roots, that it's attached to a tree that's attached deeply down into this whole root system. And I think when we lose sight of that, it has this ability for the work that we're doing to be that surface level, and we're losing out on that deeper context and depth. And so to me, that's really what being traditional, I don't know if I really align with beyond that word, is just that somebody who, I understand that this tool is really powerful for healing, and I'm trying to be as much in integrity with it as possible, to understand it as deeply as I possibly can. And then to teach it from that place too, right? So I feel that there's like a different level of responsibility when we're teaching a healing art, or a musical instrument, or really anything from a culture that's not our own, is that we should have this kind of cultural integrity and respect for it, so that we're not just like taking these systems of healing and then making them into whatever it feels most suitable for our own purposes. And I guess here's another thing to this, is that a lot of times this is happening because people have profound experiences, whether it be with the chakras or with Reiki or with different symbols, from different traditions. They have powerful experiences of it, and then they use those experiences to try to tell other people what they can expect when working or practicing with that. So, for example, like, oh, I had this amazing clearing of my heart chakra, and in that clearing, I felt maybe a connection to, like feeling more physically healthy in my heart. Or let's say, that's a very good example, but then it's like, okay, then I'm going to do this clearing for your heart chakra, Micahela, and you're going to feel physically better in your heart too. And that is using your own subjective experience to inform somebody else's experience. And that actually just doesn't work in energy medicine, because our work is actually so deeply personal, and our own experiences are so deeply personal. But like things like chakras or the three diamonds or the whole practice of Reiki actually give us a container. It gives us a structure with which to explore those subjective experiences. And it is our work and a task not to project that onto other people, like to expect that they'll have a similar experience to me or to anyone else. And that's where spirituality is this very, very personal experience. But then it's interpersonal, because we can share it, and we create a shared language with which to understand it, and share that shared language of our own different experiences together. And from that, we can learn and grow from each other as well.
Yeah. I love, Carrie, that you talked about the kind of umbrella category of energy medicine, and then Reiki and the chakra system and yoga and many other things being inside of that category. And I think I think that's something that isn't actually talked about enough. And in the absence of that acknowledgement, what we get is the word Reiki applied to all kinds of things that are not Reiki. And as if that's the only term that could describe an energy healing practice, or, a meditation practice. And then we'll have a word like mindfulness applied in a blanket term to all meditation, as if mindfulness is the only form of meditation, which is also a tradition that's been extracted out of its Buddhist origins and presented as a standalone practice in ways that cause all kinds of challenges. And so I think that's a really important, thing for us to talk about and to really advocate for, is understanding that the category of work is, we could call energy medicine, that's a kind of a generic term, but I think that's kind of what we need in this instance, is like, generally speaking, there's this type of experience. And then inside of that, humans over the millennia, in different cultural and historic contexts and different times and places, have undertaken to explain and to share with other people powerful experiences that they personally had around energy work, around energy medicine, or whatever, that category is. And that those things become specific, right? They become those containers that you're describing that hold an experience within a particular context, that has flexibility enough for people to make it their own, but that has a form of specific context that helps to convey that original experience and how that experience came to be. And that specificity matters, and this is something that there's debate about. I mean, I've definitely had people really challenge me on that notion that it matters that you specifically, you call Reiki because it comes from a place where that word is from, right? Like, that word is a Japanese word. It means something specific. And that you don't apply that word to a tradition that is very different from that other one. You'll use a different word, like call it energy medicine, or create your own word, or, use a word that's more specific to what's actually being done. Or that reflects in some way that this is a combination of different practices. And this is something that there's a lot of resistance to. And I think part of it is name recognition. People know what the word Reiki means in a generic sense. And so if you say, I do Reiki, there's a certain gravitas or whatever to saying that I do that thing, but now I'm qualifying it all these different ways that make it something different. So that's one thing. And I appreciated very much you naming that. And then just the other thing that stood out kind of on a lighter level, Bronwen, when you were talking about, people might say too complex to study something like Reiki in the way that we're talking about, with historical and cultural context. That does require some study, some reading, some immersion in original source material or good interpretations of that source material. But that other forms of practice that don't do any of that can be incredibly complex. And I was thinking of my own experience of, before I found my way to you as a teacher and to this path of understanding the origins of Reiki, I was so dissatisfied with my practice because I knew that it was Japanese practice. I had, childhood experiences with Japanese culture that did not resonate with what I was learning in my Reiki classes. And there was no explanation of that at all. There was no one saying, well, this is what it means that this is a Japanese practice. This is how it is Japanese. Here is the Japaneseness of this practice. There was none of that. And it was becoming very dissatisfying. And my practice was really stagnant because of that dissatisfaction. And so I went looking, for what could cure that stagnation. And I, for a time, started studying more and more New Age forms of Reiki, thinking that, well, these more complex systems that are, the compassion Reiki and the holy fire Reiki and all of these other forms, they must be better, right? They must be more powerful, as you said.
Well, they say they are.
Because they say they are, right? I'm like, why did I think that? I just paused, why did I think that? And so I did a Karuna Reiki class specifically, and it was so complex. 8 new symbols that all had very, very, very complex like indications for what they were used to address and what they meant, and the way that you had to do them. It was so complex. And just to even utilize it in my practice with clients, I made these posters to put on the wall in my studio that like had the symbol and had images that would remind me of what it was. I didn't want to put all the words because I didn't want to look like I had cheat sheets on the wall, which I absolutely did. But I would make these images that reminded me what each symbol meant, and I could never memorize them. Like I couldn't, and obviously if I got more dedicated to that practice, I certainly could have learned them. I could have memorized them. But the reality was I just continued to be so dissatisfied that I just never bothered to put in that amount of effort. And as I've said in other conversations, almost gave Reiki up altogether because I was just like, I was so frustrated. And the thing that I noticed was that the more complex that those systems of practice got and the more confusing they got, the less effective the experience was for myself and for clients.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I was so in my head about like, I have to understand these things. And, coming home to the simplicity of the original form. And that has, of course, its own complexity. The complexity, though, is in the context, right? The context is complex, but it's also rich and fascinating. And it's like so juicy to get into. The practice itself is incredibly simple, right? And so it was a super interesting inversion of that, right? The context when I was learning Karuna Reiki was almost non-existent. Like, where did this come from? What is this about? What is, who knows? Who cares? But the practice itself was incredibly complex and supposedly more powerful. When I inverted that and spent my mental energy on learning the context and then spent my practice energy on this very, very simple form, the effectiveness increased, the power of it increased. It became a more powerful practice. And I, now feel very confident saying that to people. Like, if you want the most powerful practice of Reiki, let me show you what it looked like in its original form, as well as I can, given who I am in the world.
And I think that's because you're embodying it. You're not just in your head trying to follow some sort of thing. I mean, if we put all our energy into memorizing and being technical, then how does that relate to actually embodying a practice? Mm. Great.
Now,
Well,
I have also tried to memorize the Heart Sutra in its original Japanese. That is complex and it takes a lot of mental energy. But
Reiki, and I mean, really, this is where this is what I was saying before. We don't have to do that,
right, exactly. It was like it was a passion project, it was like it was there because I was intellectually stimulated by it. And, in terms of practicing it, it's much more powerful a practice when I just read it off the paper and don't bother trying to remember it, right? That's when it's actually like powerful as a practice. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I do get concerned that, sometimes I think we bring in too much Japaneseness, if you know what I mean. Because what's happening then is, people trying to outdo each other with like, oh yeah, I know this and I know that. But does it really relate to the system of Reiki? Not always. I mean, obviously it is a Japanese practice, but it's a bit like, I'm going to say something silly now, but it's a bit like if there was an Australian practice, yeah, and you're all trying to, learn this Australian practice, and then someone said, well, I can sing, um, the Australian, what do you call it?
The
The
national anthem.
national anthem, right? And, I can sing the national anthem, therefore, I'm better at this practice. Not necessarily, right? In fact, most Australians can't sing the national anthem. So, but yes, so what I'm saying is that, don't be down on yourself, peoples. If you're not like, doing all these Japanese things and, rituals, and it's not necessary. The system is simple, and following the structure of the practices doesn't have to be overly complicated. And it really is, as we were just saying, it's about embodying that practice rather than actually trying to learn something and ticking things off and getting certificates and things like that, because that's not necessarily what it's about. The only thing I had that I wrote down when someone was talking was just about the three diamonds, that the three diamonds as a structure work very clearly within the system of Reiki, and they support us because they're actually grounded in Japanese cosmology. So we have this sort of flow through that's flowing through into our practice, which I just think is really beautiful. And that's where our conversation started, which was about what Carrie was calling the subtle body. And we, so we were just discussing what might that mean from different angles, and the three diamonds and how we would work with them. That, their grounding for us is that it actually grounds us takes us right back into this Japanese culture and understanding and belief. So, which is really beautiful. And once again, you don't need to know everything about it, but it is there. And it is something that, I've always said that the practices that exist today, like the chakra system, for example, they are amazing. They have been around for thousands of years. The practices that have been around for thousands of years, there's a reason why they've been around for thousands of years, because people have definitely felt that they can embody them, that they live them, and that living them is then passed on to other people. So great chat. Thank you, everyone. I know Carrie's got a course coming up about Reiki and chakras, yes, no's, and histories and things.
Well, it's called The History of the Chakras, and it's really about going all the way back to the beginning and really understanding where the chakras came from and what their original purpose came from, why they were created, and for what aim and for what purpose. And I think the truth is we live in these modern times where we have access to lots of different forms of healing. And if you found healing with the chakras, the chakras, according to these ancient texts, that they need to be awakened. We can't just say, oh yeah, like this template works. It's a process of awakening, and if you've gone through that process and you've experienced profound energetic spiritual shifts through the chakras, then you can't just say like, no, let's just turn the page and use a different system. That system is for you. You've worked with it, you've embodied it, like you said. So how do we respectfully bring that together within energy medicine and in a more general sense, and Reiki in a more particular sense? So that's a little bit about what the course is about, and I'm going to be teaching it live in a couple of days. So more than likely, if you're listening to this, you've already missed that, but I will be offering it as a pre-recorded course. And so giving you just, a deeper historical context, and talking about how these ideas of the subtle body weave into our general understanding of working with spiritual energy, and giving you some resources to dive deeper on and do that, digging deep and getting into primary sources, and working with some more experienced people other than myself to point you in the direction of people that I think you'd like to learn more from. So yeah, I'll leave a link to that in the show notes. So thanks so much.
And Micahela, you've got a retreat coming up. Oh, there was something really interesting. What was in your newsletter today?
Yeah, I do have a retreat coming up in September called the Souls on Deck retreat. That'll be in person in Northern California, and really, leaning into community and into capacity building around being in challenging times, and really building our capacity to be our full self inside of those times. And of course, drawing on the system of Reiki and the system of soul collage. And then a dear friend of mine who is also a yoga teacher will be leading some yogic movement as part of that experience as well. So any of you are in Northern California or want to travel here and do some really magical work in community, we would love to have you.
There was the other thing with Lynn Galliano, was it?
Yes, so that is a new monthly circle that we're trying out, and really, out of a desire to, she and I both host different community spaces that are focused on applying Reiki in our own, recovery and healing journeys. But we also wanted a space where we could really explicitly discuss and work with specific social and political things happening, like the United States election that's coming up. A lot of stress, a lot of emotions are running high around those things. There's a lot of, just things happening legally and socially that are really challenging to folks and that are really threatening to a lot of our communities. And so we wanted a place where we could be explicit about that and to name those dynamics and use our practices to work with them, and then also to support each other in taking action in response. So that gathering is called Reiki Plus Action, and it's just a donation-based, donation optional space, no one turned away, that will be held online. And the first one will be August 3rd, I believe, the first Saturday of the month, starting in August.
Yeah, that sounds overwhelmingly good, actually. Yeah, I mean, it's a big thing, isn't it? So that's lovely to have that support for people out there as well. Great. Oh, and I'm working on well, I haven't got anything coming up straight away, but nothing specific. But I have been working really hard and pushing myself on creating an online course for, it's called Shimpadon Plus, and it's for existing Reiki teachers. And it's a course that is video and reading materials, as well as a whole bunch of other stuff. And there's also some live stuff attached to it as well. So that's something that is, who knows how long it'll take me to get it together, but I am working hard, and hopefully that will be out sometime this year. Thank you, everyone, for being with us today and thinking about what it means. Traditional, not traditional, doesn't mean anything to you and your practice. Feel free to contact any of us if you need to discuss this. We also have our Facebook page and our Facebook group, Embodying Reiki. And so come along there, have a chat about it if you're feeling unsure, or if you've got something to say. We'd love to hear you. Yeah. All right. Bye for now. Oh, and don't forget to like it and all those sorts of wonderful things. Yep. Bye for now.
Bye.